So in a recent case brought before the court, an employer withdrew a conditional employment contract upon discovering that the potential employee had a criminal record. The employee then took the employer to the Labour Court claiming unfair discrimination. One of the claims is that an automatically unfair dismissal took place on an arbitrary ground of past convictions within the realm of Section 187 of the Labour Relations Act. So what was the court's ruling, and can your criminal record prevent you from getting a job? Let's now bring in experts, associate at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr in the Employment Law Division, Biron Madisa, who's joining us in a studio. Biron, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. I look, as an example, at Gayton McKenzie, our new Minister of Sports and Arts and Culture. He was convicted. He has a criminal record. And the same may apply to Kenny Kunene as well, who's the Deputy President of the Patriotic Alliance. Both men are now, of course, in politics. One is the Minister of Arts and Culture, and the other one is the MMC in the city of Joburg. So how do we answer that question? Does a criminal record prevent me from getting a job?
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning to your listeners and viewers at home. So, in the recent judgment, the Labour Court actually answered that question. The Labour Court, in the case of O'Connor versus Nexus, dealt with the question, is a clear criminal record an inherent requirement of the job? And in answering that question, the Labour Court found that on the facts that was before the court, it was clear that a clear criminal record on those facts was not related to the inherent requirements of the job. So basically what the court has said to us is, in certain instances, a clear criminal record might be a requirement for you getting a job. But the court also remarked that this is not always the case. There might be instances where a clear criminal record is related to the inherent requirement of the job. And under those circumstances, it might then be justified for you not getting employed when you have a criminal record.
Yeah, so that would, for instance, apply to a police officer, if I'm not mistaken, as an example.
So it would depend on the nature of the job, but a police officer would be one such example. Another example would be someone in the financial sector, which is heavily regulated. So if you're dealing with someone who has a previous conviction for theft, fraud, and defeating the end of justice, for example, then that individual might be excluded on that basis.
So does it mean that if an employer goes out to the labor market and has an advertisement and says that we have a vacancy, this is the job title, part of the criteria is that you must have a clear criminal record? However, though, if you look at the job spec and what is expected of the individual, it doesn't really emphasize the importance of having a clear criminal record. Would that then mean that that is an unfair discrimination? How should we interpret and understand that?
So each case will be dealt with on its own facts. So you will consider the nature of the job and look at what will this employee be doing in the business. However, it's important to emphasize that every employment relationship is based on trust. With that having been said, it might then be justified in certain instances to make that requirement to say, if you have a criminal record, that you will not be employed for a specific job.
Yeah.
So it's a factual basis consideration that will have to be taken on each case on its merit. So it's not a blanket approach.
Okay, I'm trying to think now of a job that wouldn't necessarily require a clean criminal record. Can we make an example of a cleaner?
Yes.
Could that be an example?
That could be an example.
So if the employer then advertises this particular vacancy, can I argue as an applicant that it is discriminatory to say that people who have previously been convicted would not qualify for this job?
Yes, you can. And that was exactly what Mr. O'Connor did in this recent Labour Court judgment, because he argued that it wasn't, and this is a case where the employer, which is Nexus, did not actually provide reasons why they had that requirement for that specific position. And the court then found that because of that, they didn't have those reasons. They found that then it was unfair discrimination in terms of the Employment Equity Act to exclude Mr. O'Connor or retract that offer of employment solely based on him having a criminal record.
Sometimes when you do apply for a job, you are asked to fill in a form. Fingerprints are being taken as well, and they will then run a vetting process and also a background check. Is that legal?
So that is legal, but the court made it a point that employers shouldn't do that willy-nilly. You should only do or follow that process where the job in question requires that an employee who will eventually be appointed have a clear record. So you're not going through that process for each and every position or every employee that you want to appoint. There must be a reason or a justification for why you included a clear record as one of the requirements.
Yep. You touched on the issue around trust, and that's the nexus, I guess, of an employment contract as well, is that the employer trusts that you will do the job, and the employee trusts that the employer will then compensate the employee for the work that they've done. But trust also speaks to your past. What is it that I know about your past, and whether on the basis of your past would I be able to trust you? Just an example. Let's say that you work in, there's a job offer in a firm where there is a manager, perhaps maybe who is a victim of gender-based violence, and the person who is a candidate for the job has been convicted on a gender-based violence charge. The manager might feel uncomfortable being in the same environment with that particular individual. But it goes back to the point that you raised a bit earlier on, that the job might not require a clean criminal record. What happens in that particular case? Because I, as the manager, need to also feel comfortable working with this particular individual.
I think it is also important to remember that while one might have a criminal history, they've also served their time. So it shouldn't be that people who were previously convicted of crimes are forever excluded in society and also in the job market. So that's a key consideration as well. And with that, you might want to look at the time frame. How long ago was this person convicted of these crimes? It might be that, like in the case of Mr. O'Connor, it was over 20 years ago. In that instance, we might then assume that perhaps this person has been rehabilitated and we shouldn't exclude them based on that.
Who determines that, though? Who decides whether an individual has been fully rehabilitated? Because even if you look at the stats, some of the former convicts, once they have been released, reoffend. I think that they said about 80% reoffend.
Yes, I think the approach is that we assume that they've been rehabilitated,
yes,
and then we take a chance.
Who determines whether this individual has been fully rehabilitated?
I would say time determines that, because once they have served their time for whatever previous crimes they might have committed, they then come back into society and we assume that they've been rehabilitated. So
the man who was accused of killing Uinene Mkhwetyana worked for the post office, had a previous conviction, but then went on again to reoffend. So there is that risk that there could be a possibility of reoffending.
There is definitely that risk, and that's why one of the factors you would look at in appointing a person who was formerly convicted, you might look at the job in question and look at that in contrast with the previous conviction. If then you find that the job in question does not necessarily relate to that person's previous conviction, then you might take a chance and appoint them into that position, provided that they meet all the other requirements for that specific job.
Can the staff members that are employed by the company who then become a victim of crime by this particular individual who has a history of criminality, a previous conviction, can they bring a lawsuit against the company and say that you have put my life in danger by appointing somebody who clearly has a criminal record?
No, they cannot do that. There are other avenues that they can follow, like having that person through the justice system, but not against the employer per se.
So you can't bring it against the employer. So what's your advice to people who do have a criminal record right now, who have been applying for work, and that some of the biggest, the tough issues that are faced by people with previous convictions is the reintegration into society, which has been a major issue as well. What's your advice to them?
So I would say keep applying. Eventually someone will take a chance. The difficulty is that sometimes prospective employers don't make it clear that the reason you are not employed is because of that previous conviction. So sometimes it's difficult to know that you got disqualified for that reason. They might just say you were not a suitable candidate, and that's where the difficulty sort of lies. But sometimes they will make it clear that they can appoint you because of that criminal record. In those instances, like Mr. O'Connor, you then have recourse in our courts.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Biron Madisa, Employment Law Associate at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, Inc. Thank you so much for making time for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.